Last year, when I first started using my saw, I didn't know a whole lot about it. I had a big learning curve just trying to figure out how to use it. Looking back on it, one of the things I regretted the most was that I didn't do a little maintenance on it before I used it the first time. After I got home, I read up a little bit on what maintenance to do. So when I got back to Alaska, one of the first things that I wanted to get done was get maintenance done on my saw. I've got so many plans that rely on this saw, I've got to make sure it lasts a long time. Once I got the oil changed, the next thing to do was change out the transmission fluid that keeps the gears lubricated. It only took about half a quart, way less than I expected. I got the saw blade I ruined last year retipped, and since I knew it was sharp, I decided to start my cutting with it. It's nothing beats a sharp blade. You always got to make sure you got everything on tight. Not much would be worse than a saw blade coming loose while you're using it. Then I needed to clean out the cooling fin. The next task was to shovel up all the sawdust that I'd left over the winter. It would have been a lot easier when it was dry, but I like to wait until things are nice and wet and heavy. That makes life way better. With the mill all ready to go, it was time to turn some logs into lumber. Last year, I didn't get some 16 and 20 footers cut, so that was my first order of business this year, to finish out my garage. Those 20 footers barely fit on, but I managed to get it in place without ruining anything. I always hold my breath. That pile of sawdust makes a convenient backstop. I was glad I had my wife along to help me out. Trying to move 20-foot 2x6s takes a little bit of oomph on your own, but with two people, you can manage pretty well. Although these weren't the biggest logs I'd sawn, they were nice and straight with very tight grain, perfect for what I needed them for. I only needed a half dozen or so, but ended up cutting about 20 of each. These 16-footers would fit nicely in my garage. It would keep them out of the weather and have them right where I needed them later this summer when I go to finish out my garage. So here's 15 2x6x16s. They'll go across that gap right there. So I ran into two problems on that very last log. This bearing's obviously struggling, but then the other thing that was terrible is one of the blocks I used must have had a little screw in it because it did that. That's not going to cut so well. Removing the old roller wasn't too hard, just took a couple of wrenches and it came right out. This was partly because it was so worn. Now trying to get the new one on, that took a little bit more effort. First I tried to put it on as a whole piece, but no matter how I tried, I couldn't get it to fit where it needed to go. Eventually, I had to separate it into several different pieces, put it in place while it was loose, and then tighten everything up once it was in place. This worked out pretty well. It wasn't that tough, but it was definitely a first this, then that sort of operation. With that out of the way, I replaced my broken blade with another blade I had laying around, but I knew it wasn't sharp, so I was definitely going to have to sharpen it before I could cut much lumber. It was raining, so I was going to do it under the tarp. However, I couldn't get the sharpener to turn on. That's a problem. And my motor wasn't working, so I did a little testing. And when I hook it direct to the terminals, it works fine. When I hook it through the circuit board, it doesn't work. So I just pulled the circuit board off. I'm going to bypass that, solder stuff in place, and hopefully I'll be back up and in business. With the sharpener working, I got that blade sharpened up pretty quick. I was amazing how well it worked, and I could definitely tell a difference in the way it cut. Of course, my things don't stay nice very long. With the saw back up and running, I spent the rest of the day cutting over 80 2x4s. I don't have a specific use for these yet, but I'm sure I'll need them as I build my house. Last 2 days I've milled up 3 logs this size. My mistake pile's a lot less than last year, so I think that's a good sign. Now that I got all the hemlock cut that I needed to, it was time to turn my attention to cedar. I was going to need a bunch of cedar siding for my garage. A friend of mine found me a few cedar logs. They weren't the world's best cedar logs, but they were free, and I really appreciated him finding them for me. Getting them on the truck was easy. Getting them off, I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to go about it, but hydraulics, they're amazing. The first log unloaded pretty darn easy. So it was time to go for the big cedar. I wasn't sure if the bobcat could lift the whole thing, so I decided to do it in portions. The plan was to pull most of it off the trailer, then lift it up so we could drive the trailer out from underneath of it. It seemed like a good plan. And, unlike most of my plans, it actually worked just fine. Then I've got the cedars that I'm going to cut today. This guy here especially should be a rodeo. We'll see how it goes. The first log was kind of an odd shape, so I decided to cut off the protruding portions. However, I'm not very good at this. I made a lot of sawdust, probably ruined some siding, and wasn't able to remove the piece that I wanted to cut off. Eventually, I just decided to tackle it with the sawmill. Trying to put a log that's flat on one side on the mill can be kind of tricky, because one wrong roll and you can't move it anymore, at least not by hand. I wasn't sure who was going to win this lifting contest, but in the end, with the aid of my trusty bent pry bar, I was able to get it into place. Getting it flattened out wasn't all that tough. It was just moving the saw around a lot without making any boards. However, after a little bit, I got a piece jammed between the blade and the saw. I was able to get that free, and back we went. However, 2 or 3 minutes later, and my saw wouldn't start. I wasn't sure what was up with it. After talking with my buddy, he suggested it was probably a kill switch issue, and he was right. Once I got that taken care of, I was able to get back to business. And so I think that's what was causing my problem, the backfiring and then the not starting. So we'll put it back together, see where that gets us. I did a lot of cutting, but I didn't get very many good boards. In fact, I'm not sure if I got any at all. Most of the way through this log with not much to show for it, I got a lot of stuff that looks like this, or this, or this. With that log out of the way, it was time to move on to the next one. Today, it's been raining all night, blowing pretty good. I've got this cedar on the mill, ready to cut. However, once I got it here, started looking, it's got all of these branches coming right out of the center section here. I suspect that this is all just going to be crapping through here, and probably really hard on my saw. So this is what she looks like now. You got knots like this that are going to break in the board. Then ones like that I don't think are going to do anything. We'll see. Not sure how good those actually are, but they're definitely better than yesterday's, so we'll take it. These guys here with this knot that goes all the way through, it might be hard to nail, but it looks pretty solid, so I'll have to look into it a little bit, but at least we got some boards. That's a good thing. About everything I could get out of this log, I think. Not a lot of 8x. Fair amount of the battens, though. This final log had been scaring me for a little bit. It was so big it barely fit under the mill. Trying to move it around without the skid steer would be nearly impossible. However, it rolled nicely into place. The problem with this log was that it was pretty rotten in the center. I was able to get some good boards out of the edges, but there wasn't anything worth salvaging in the center. The old log got turned into about this much lumber. It cost me about $25 worth of gas and about 4 hours of my day. Still haven't decided whether or not it's worth it, but That's lumber I have now. Stuff I couldn't use out of the big old nasty log. I'll cut most of it up into firewood. And then these big posts I'll use to put under my lumber piles so I can pick them up with the forklift. As is our tradition, the day before we left, we covered all our lumber with plastic. We're trying a different covering method this year. We'll see if it works any better than the last one. The last one actually worked pretty well. End of another trip to Alaska. It's kind of a sad day. Always is when it's time to leave. But got a fair amount done. Got a bunch of wood cut, all tarped and covered. We'll see if it stays that tarped and covered after a few windstorms. I suspect it'll struggle a little bit, but what are you gonna do? Cutting lumber sure isn't easy, but it's a lot of fun. And I can't wait to come back here and make a bunch more sawdust.